We are starting our next topic on Explain Why session. Why subthalamic lesion may cause hemiballismus. Now, what is hemiballismus? Hemiballismus is a type of unilateral chorea. It is characterized by sudden, flailing, and violent involuntary movement. And it usually involves one half of the body, and the proximal muscles of the limbs are commonly involved. And it occurs due to the vascular disease which is causing the damage of the contralateral subthalamic nucleus. Usually chronic badly controlled hypertension or diabetes mellitus with subsequent lacunar infarction may cause the subthalamic nucleus damage. Sometimes it resolves spontaneously in the weeks following its onset. It is sometimes due to other types of structural diseases. In the past, it was an occasional complication of thalamotomy. To understand the pathophysiology of this, why subthalamic lesion is causing hemiballismus, we need to know the connections of the striatum. So in the basal ganglia chapter, we know that there is a communications between the cortex and the basal ganglia via thalamus. There are two pathways of these connections. One is the direct pathway, another is the indirect pathway. So we know that in the direct pathway, actually the nerve fibers that converge on the striatum from all parts of the cerebral cortex via corticostriate projection, and their ending contains the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate. So from the motor cortex, the excitatory glutamate, it is stimulating the striatum. Now the striatum has two major efferent connections. It is giving nerve fibers nerve supply to both globus pallidus internus and globus pallidus externus, and both of these supply is inhibitory because it is releasing GABA. So the function of striatum is to inhibit the globus pallidus internus as well as globus pallidus externus. Now what happens in direct pathway? In the direct pathway, the striatum is directly communicating with globus pallidus internus and inhibiting it. What is the function of globus pallidus internus that is inhibited by striatum? Its function is to inhibit the thalamus, because this fiber from the internus to thalamus is also secreting GABA. And we can see that the fibers that is going from thalamus to motor cortex, it is stimulatory. It is green in color, so it is stimulatory. So the input from the output from thalamus to cerebral cortex or the motor cortex, it is stimulatory. So in the direct pathway, we can see this stimulatory effect is inhibited by globus pallidus internus. This inhibition will be inhibited by the striatum. So ultimately we can say in the direct pathway there will be stimulation of the motor cortex, because the inhibitory function of the globus pallidus internus is prevented by the inhibitory action of striatum. So direct pathway is stimulatory. Now in indirect pathway we can see striatum is not directly connected to globus pallidus internus. It first communicates with the globus pallidus externus, then communicate with the subthalamic nucleus, then it goes to the globus pallidus internus. And we know the connections from the globus pallidus internus to thalamus, it is always GABA, the neurotransmitter, and it is inhibited. Now what is happening in indirect pathway? In the indirect pathway, we can see that the striatum is inhibiting the globus pallidus externus. What is the function of externus? Its function is to inhibit the subthalamic nucleus. What is the function of subthalamic nucleus? Its function is to stimulate the inhibitory action of globus pallidus internus. So what actually happens here? The subthalamic nucleus, its inhibition by the globus pallidus externus is inhibited by the striatum. Now the subthalamic nucleus is free to do what? Free to stimulate the globus pallidus internus. And what is the function of internus? Its function is to inhibit the thalamocortical fiber. So we can say that indirect pathway is inhibitory, whereas direct pathway is stimulatory. Now come to the disease hemiballismus. What is the cause of hemiballismus? It is caused by the damage of the subthalamic nucleus. These subthalamic nucleus, which is the potent stimulator of globus pallidus internus, which in turn inhibits the cerebral cortex via thalamus in the indirect pathway. So the inhibition in the indirect pathway, it is withdrawn due to the damage of the subthalamic nucleus, because there is no one to stimulate now the globus pallidus internus, and so that the globus pallidus internus, the inhibitory action, it is not going to act. So ultimately the thalamus is giving a stimulatory signal to the motor cortex. So both direct and indirect pathway are now giving stimulatory signals to motor cortex. This will be characterized by sudden, violent, involuntary movements of the patient. Thank you. I think it explains the pathophysiology of hemiballismus in subthalamic lesion. Subscribe the channel.